tensions between the global North and the South at the United Nations climate negotiations, he's expanded his research into what explains the failure to address climate change in the United States. Dr. Roberts' approach to his research is to learn about social change by participating with leading actors, engaged actors in the real world. His climate and development lab at Brown partners with research institutions and NGOs and organizations at the local level and national level and global level. And he's a leader in Rhode Island's efforts to plan for climate change. He teaches courses on equity and the environment, on globalization and the environment, and practicum group workshop courses on local, national, and global environmental policy issues. He recently served on the board on environmental change and society of the National Academy of Sciences and as a visiting research fellow in the Stockholm Environment Institute. Following Dr. Roberts' presentation today, we'll hear responses from Dr. Jameson Chace and Cassidy Curry and Flo Blanco. Dr. Chace is professor of biology and biomedical sciences here at Salve, as well as faculty director of community engaged learning and chair of the Department of Cultural, Environmental, and Global Studies. And he's also a McAuley scholar in the Mercy Interdisciplinary Faculty Collaborative around the critical concern of Earth. Cassidy Curry is a junior here at Salve. She's an environmental studies major and a double minor in liberal studies and religious studies. And she also served for the past 2 years and continues to serve as a sustainability coordinator here at Salve. And Florencia Reiche Blanco is also a junior here at Salve, double majoring in environmental studies, as well as sociology and anthropology. And this past November, Flo and Cassidy and Dr. Chace served as delegates for Salve at COP26 at the Global Climate Change Conference that this year was held in Glasgow, Scotland, where this came from. We look forward to your responses and contributions with Flo and Cassidy and Dr. Chace today, which we hope will be a really meaningful conversation for us around political power and the common good, why climate action is hard. So now please join me in welcoming our speaker for today, J. Timmons Roberts.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ladrigan. Let's see if I can get this off mute. There, can you hear me now? Thank you very much, Dr. Ladrigan with Welpley. I want to get that right. And to Dr. Chace and to Flo and Cassidy for doing this really great. And I was at Glasgow too, but there's so many different things that happen. I really look forward to hearing what you guys have to say. And I hope my talk is useful for Salve today in connecting of some things. There was so much I could have talked about. I decided to focus on the state level and the national level of this issue. As Teresa just said, I spent a long time going to the UN negotiations trying to understand the relationships of power and justice between the world's wealthiest countries and the poor countries over the issue of climate change. And really it was fascinating, and it remains a part of my sort of core issues that I care about, and I work on that. But when our former president withdrew the United States, or announced the withdrawal of the United States from the Paris Agreement, which we had spent 10 years watching it being built and how difficult it was to negotiate, and then for him to just withdraw from, be the only country on earth to not participate in the Paris Agreement, I decided that I needed to bring my team back home and for us to try to understand what's going on in America. Why are we such a problem case? So, the United States is a huge part of the problem of climate change, and yet we've known since at least 1988, when Jim Hansen gave testimony in Congress about the reality of climate change on a hot day in July, that climate change was serious, that it was human caused, that it was something that we needed to take very seriously and change our society. And yet we've failed. In some ways, we've failed 33 years in a row, 34 now. We're up to the Conference of the Parties number 26, and yet emissions continue to rise in the world. So I'm going to argue that really political power is the reason. I mean, we have for climate change, we know the science, right? It's happening, it's serious. We know that, the impacts it's going to have on Newport, Rhode Island. We know the impacts it's going to have on the poor people in, semi-arid regions in Africa and in low-lying barrier islands and so on. We know the science. We have the technology to solve the problem, and we have for quite a long time. There are things that we would like to have a little bit better. Some things will make it easier. The technology has gotten tremendously cheaper. Solar panels and wind turbines are much more effective than they were, and much more affordable. And we have storage and so on, and we can do this even if we don't. I mean, when Kennedy said we're going to the moon by the end of the 1960s, he didn't know how they were going to get there. He just said we're going to go to the moon. So now we know that we have to reduce our emissions by about half by 2030 and about 100% by 2050. I mean, that's what the science is saying. And we don't know exactly how we're going to get there. We don't know all the technologies, but even using the technologies that we have, we can do it. So we have the science, we have the technology, and we have the policy tools. We have a lot of public policy tools that could make this happen, but we haven't done it. So I've really come to believe that we need to pay attention very closely to the actors in society who are blocking this transition, blocking our society from dealing with this, tremendously important problem that threatens the world that you all face, and even adults. I mean, it used to be old people would say, oh, you guys are going to have to deal with it. Well, that's not true anymore. We're all having to deal with it. It's already happening, as you can see by wildfires. And let's see if I can get this to advance. And this to advance. So I'm sorry, I have just a quote from my provost up here, that institutions of higher education are at this moment, essential at this moment, and Brown in particular has the privilege and responsibility to be a force for necessary change. And I definitely get that from Salve's mission statements too, that there's this feeling that the university needs to be a part of the solution and can be. And these are some of my groups of students in my climate and development lab at Brown. Each year I bring in about 12 undergraduates into the lab. So it seems like we have kind of a choice here, the common good represented by a livable, prosperous planet. But we have this overwhelming political power with polluters and their supporters that could drive us to this other future here. I'm reminded of a book called Capitalist Realism, Is There No Alternative? By Mark Fisher, where he says it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism, which is stunning. I mean, how did that happen? That we are not willing to consider deep changes to our economic system. And I'm not saying overthrow or stop capitalism entirely, but we need to, undertake very drastic reforms of our economic system. So this photograph was taken by an amateur photographer and a skydiver named Christy McClue in Oregon State in 2017. It sort of symbolizes our nation's response to climate change. Many people think that if enough climate disasters, these were this series of fires across the West, if they just got bad enough that people will act, leaders will be unable to ignore them and the will of the people. In my mind, this view is entirely wrong-headed. That they've shown our leaders that they will not act in spite of the disasters because they're simply being manipulated. They have other interests besides dealing with this. The media sometimes fails to draw the connection between these disasters like wildfires and hurricanes and tornadoes and et cetera. though this is starting to change. The media is getting better, but it's not fully there. Rather, there's also a personal disconnection between experiencing or knowing about these disasters and taking real action in our lives. There's assumptions of what we're expected to do, which are shaped by the economic and the social structures in which we live. And we live in this hyper-polarized political context where these disasters, like these fires, even in times of historic droughts, are blamed on things like bad land management or seen as inevitable. So I want to get us beyond the helplessness of the feeling of climate change is happening and it's inevitable, rather to identify like sort of who's responsible for us not acting, and then kind of figuring out together how we can address that and move beyond it. Scientists for over a dozen years have said that we need to stay below 2 degrees Celsius, or that's 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. So here's what would need to happen for us to do that. So if we had started acting back in about 2000, we could have followed this curve here, which would mean we'd have to reduce our emissions of greenhouse gases, of carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxides, chlorofluorocarbons, and stuff like that, by about just 2% a year. So one climate scientist says this is like, I don't know how many are skiers in the audience. Any skiers? Going down the green, the green circle, the bunny slope. But we did not. So now we're way up here. And if we had started in 2020, it'd be about 6% a year. If we wait another 10 more years after 2020 till 2030, then we have to reduce our emissions by about 10% a year. That's beyond a double black diamond slope in skiing, right? I mean, that's a suicide. That's just an incredible amount of change. So this change here, 6% a year, that's how much emissions went down because of the COVID pandemic, when flights were canceled, people stayed home, and that's the amount of reductions we had. We need that every year to get our emissions to a rate that would be avoiding the most dangerous of climate change impacts. So here's what I'm going to talk about. Gridlock, delay, and sometimes rollback climate action in America at the federal level. I'm going to try to be quick about that. And then I'm going to talk about the state level, because there's a lot of really cool stuff here going on in Rhode Island. I'm also going to look at Massachusetts really briefly. I'm going to talk about who's driving the slowdown in climate policy and how, and some things that we might do in universities. Does that sound all right? So I'll start with this national level. What's happening at the federal level in the US? So President Obama, I mean, some of the more recent examples of this in your lifetimes has been, was trying to put forward some climate policies. And the national government really is the logical place that you should take climate action. It's, if you're going to do something like a carbon tax or a carbon price, much better to do it over the whole country than to try to do it at one state, because all the states will say, well, everybody's going to go buy their gasoline in Connecticut or in Massachusetts if you're Rhode Island. So it's a logical place to do the policy. But the action at the federal level has always been inadequate. When Obama took office in 2009, the Democrats had both houses of Congress and the White House, and there was some legislation moving called Waxman-Markey, but they never brought it to the Senate because they knew they didn't have enough votes to pass it. Really, he started advancing climate policy much later, and especially in his second term, when he became a real leader in the Paris Agreement and was quite successful. He also pushed for this thing called the Clean Power Plan, which gave it back to states to reduce their emissions from the electricity generating sector. And there was big reactions, big differences in the reactions of different states. So some of them actively resisted. Some of them, led by some attorneys generals, actually brought the case back to the Supreme Court and managed to stop his clean power plan. And then there was a sort of the Senate leadership, which managed to block his actions as well. So here, this is an example of the Senate leadership in a press conference forcing procedural vote over the Green New Deal in 2019, pushing, which was advanced by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Ed Markey from Massachusetts. Leadership saw the vote as a way to quickly bury the prospect of ambitious government-led action on climate change in the United States. And unfortunately, really, in America, it shouldn't be a partisan issue, but the Republican Party has blocked every climate change policy that's been suggested. They'll say there's now increasing admission that climate change is real, but there's not that it's something that we should be taking drastic steps to address. There was a hearing just last week in the House Oversight Committee in which some of the Republican comments were, to me, just shocking, really, about how they did not see the need for action on climate change. So why is it so bad at the federal level? Here's some data from my colleague, Robert Brule, which shows what happens to lobbying spending. Sorry, the words are chopped off there. But at the top, it says U.S. national climate lobbying expenditures totaled by year. And I'm just looking at the green bars. It rises up from about, below 50 million a year to about 350 million a year. And this was about that time when Obama was trying to advance, and the Democrats were trying to advance the Waxman-Markey climate legislation. So it's not yet dropped to the same levels that it was at. In other words, tens or hundreds of millions of dollars are being spent lobbying directly. Beyond lobbying, there's public relations spending. So this is just 5 corporations, 5 big oil companies, and how much they spend a year on advertising. And some years it's, $300 million itself, just 5 companies. And they're often telling us that they are the solution, that they've got the problem under control, that if, we're taking care of it, we're the innovators. You've seen all those ones about biofuels, and Exxon got biofuels, and it's going to be powering our cars and our trains and everything. So there's very slick campaigns that they're putting out to maintain the industry's social license to operate in spite of really protest movements that are trying to sort of undermine that. So I'm going to try to move faster here. Here's a study by Loredana Loy at Ohio State University that shows that for every extra $10,000 that a congressional member receives from industrial political action campaigns, PACs, the odds that they would vote to protect the environment went down significantly by these different amounts. So it's not just oil and gas, but it's also the mining industry, agriculture, utilities, transportation, and steel industries that are lobbying against environmental protections, and it works, and donating to campaigns. Here's the amounts donated by political party, which, these years I went from Google Slides to PowerPoint. So the years, I have to check here. I'm not sure what year this is about. In the early years, there was not much difference between Democrats and Republicans on issues of climate change. But since about 2000, they've really diverged as the leadership in the Republican Party has really come to criticize climate change. And you can see a lot more spending from the industrial interests that are listed on the side over there. So it's important to pay attention to lobbying funding, pay attention to campaign spending. And then there's these organizations that are created to make it look like, these are things that everybody should be for, and that present basically the industry's positions on climate change and other environmental issues. So when there's a risk of a climate change action, these are different policy moments, then the corporations have joined together in different coalitions over time. Sometimes when this global climate coalition became famous, then they shut it down and they just created some new ones, the Cooler Heads Coalition and the Coalition for Clean Coal Energy and so on. So in other words, there's a very complex web of organizations. Then there was the 2016 campaign when Donald Trump, who was a real estate developer and a reality TV show actor, really didn't have a climate change policy. And sometimes he even had an advertisement that he was for addressing climate change. But then when he was on the campaign trail, it appears that he really was influenced by the support that he received from the coal industry, the oil industry, and so on. And coal miners sort of became his mascots. He proposed federal policies that would have resulted in the emissions of hundreds of millions of tons of carbon dioxide equivalents. So with all the different legislation that he proposed, it would have meant much worse emissions. There's so much to talk about here today. This is a nice little briefing paper. It's a 5-pager from our group called the Climate Social Science Network up here. So if you just look at cssn.org. And then this paper is called The Structure of Climate Obstruction, in which we really try to trace these flows of funding from corporations to think tanks, trade associations, lobbying firms, to universities. Universities play an important role that I could talk about. Advocacy organizations, advertising firms, the media of different types, but especially the conservative media trying to drive the public agenda and then to drive the bigger media agenda and then to drive the policy outcomes. So all these actors on the left are trying to influence the actors on the right. So I encourage you to go find that if you're interested. I'm happy to talk more about it. But I promised I would talk about state level stuff too. And sorry, I'm fighting a cold. It's the first cold I've had in 2 years. I forgot how to be sick, you have to remember how to bring your cough drops and stuff. So states are very different. So as a result of this gridlock at the federal level, a lot of the action is now happening at the state level. So some states have enacted what are called renewable portfolio standards that say that X% of our electricity needs to come from wind, hydro, and solar power. And it varies a lot, but it's even happened in a lot of states that you might not expect that have learned that these policies actually are pretty good for the state, that they started very low and then they've sort of been creeping up. So we're actually starting to see more resistance to them. Here's greenhouse gas emissions, GHG emissions targets. So you can see much more of a division in the country on those. Let's see here. And I think there's really great opportunities for doing research and engaged work at the state level. So each state is different with different combinations of fossil dependency, urbanization, political control. I mean, my kid was in a ballet class with Governor Raimondo's, daughter, and went to school with, Nellie Gorbea, the Secretary of State's kid in the class. And in other words, Rhode Island is a small place where you can get to know the leaders, the staff, the legislators, the head of agencies, and so on. So it's a really exciting place to do work. So there's an opportunity to learn while we're doing it. You can study the testimony, which is often public. Lobbying records can be collected, and they're quite extraordinary, as I'll show you in a minute. So here's Rhode Island, of course, and here's some maps of what storm events would be in Rhode Island if they had 1 or 3 or 5 feet of sea level rise, showing greater and greater risk. So where you have 400 miles of coastline in the state, we're uniquely vulnerable. Wouldn't you think this would be a state that would be a leader on climate change? We have Democratic supermajorities in both chambers, right? I mean, it's almost, I think the Republicans are about 10% of the state legislature. We have no fossil fuel extraction, but we're spending, about $4 billion a year on fossil fuels, all of which are imported. So that would be money that we could keep in our state economy if we could produce our own energy here. I said we're vulnerable. There's strong public concern. In fact, on surveys, Rhode Island, I think, is the top in the country in terms of its concern over climate change. And nobody talks about this, but the Catholic population is actually more concerned nationally than other religious groups. So, and Rhode Island has, I think, the highest percentage of Catholics in the country. So anyway, it seems to me a best case, we should be able to get climate change taken care of. But so let's see, what are we doing in terms of generating electricity? Well, it turns out we're the 5th worst in the country, that almost all of our electricity comes from natural gas that we generate here. And just even in New England, Vermont is at the exact other end with the most of its electricity produced. So the yellow bars are renewable energy, clean or renewable and nuclear. And then the gray is the fossil fuels. So it just seems like a great example. Here we have the 6 New England states are all over the place. So it's a great scientific study, right? You have lots of variation on this variable. So in Rhode Island, we've had some climate laws, but it's really been slow to act. So in Massachusetts and Connecticut, there were bills, it stalls, this should say. I don't know what that says there. Fails in Rhode Island. So it passes in Mass and Connecticut and fails in Rhode Island. Back in 2008, it was entered in, again, introduced in 2009, 2010, 2011, and 2012. Each time it died in committee. The Global Warming Solutions Act, which created binding targets for emissions reductions in Massachusetts and Connecticut. In 2010, we had a group, this is the wrong title, I'm sorry, it's the Climate, yeah, no, that's right, the Climate Risk Reduction Act created a standing committee to understand what are the problems that we faced as a state on climate change. And my students helped with that bill. And then we helped also with this bill called the Resilient Rhode Island Act, which created some targets for the state of 80% emissions reductions by 2050. But they're not binding. And so the state sort of did some things, but didn't really get serious about it. And then for 5 years, we tried to put in a bill on carbon pricing, and it died in committee each year. We did a study on how the state could meet its targets. This is on the website of the Stockholm Environment Institute, who we hired with my lab, and it shows that we could, offshore wind ends up being a huge part of solving the problem of the state in terms of shifting off of natural gas. Here's a quote from our former Speaker of the House, Nicholas Mattiello, saying there was just nothing that Rhode Island could do to address climate change in a way that's real or impactful. So that's what we call a discourse of delay. In other words, somebody else should do it. We're small, we don't matter. But in fact, we should be the leaders, and we're part of the world. We're part of a global community, and the common good needs somebody to go first or to be part of going first along with other key actors. And then finally, this last year, there was a breakthrough in which Governor McKee took over for Governor Raimondo, who was appointed to the Commerce Department in Washington. And the legislature, this is Joe Shekarchi, who's the head of the Speaker of the House. And then here's the President of the Senate. And this signing was here in Newport on April something, in April of 2021. And this bill finally has the binding targets that we needed. So I'm really proud now of Rhode Island and that this bill made it through. So the question remains, sort of what changed between these years of inaction to finally having some action. And there was, a new governor, a new Speaker of the House who has a very different attitude. But there was also a slate of progressive candidates that were put up and passed and elected this last round. And I think these political leaders really saw that they needed to do something to keep their support. So just quickly on who's slowing the action. This is a complicated slide. This is federal lobbying from Bob Brule. Here we go, over here. So you see that who shows up in Congress the most to testify. But here's in the Rhode Island legislature, a series of years that my students and I went and dug through the archives and went to the committee rooms at the State House and totaled up who spoke up. And a number of these are really the petroleum industry and the building and real estate industry that are showing up to oppose action on climate change in the state. Here's, we did a big study in Massachusetts with some funding from the Barr Foundation. They saw that last slide. They saw this slide and they said, wow, we need this for Massachusetts. Can you do this study in Massachusetts and Connecticut? We said, yeah, we can. And you can see in Massachusetts, this is just one of the coalitions. So they have a ton of activists working on the issue of climate change. And they're really in all kinds of organizations. Some are more technical groups. There's insider groups, then there's these outside sort of some groups and some environmental justice groups. We went through all their testimony. We went through all their lobbying data. We collected information on what happens with each piece of legislation, and then we did an analysis of the coalitions. So who shows up to testify? Individuals mostly. Most of the individuals, I think 90%, are in favor of climate action. Only a very small amount were opposing the environmental, the climate action position. These are the groups that show up in favor, the blue, the green. So opposing climate action were heating oil, fossil fuels, utilities, and real estate industry, basically, in Massachusetts. And here's the amount of money they spent on lobbying over the period. These were the top ones. The ones that most often reported lobbying against the positions of environmental organizations. That's how the order in which they're ranked. So all this, Massachusetts has fantastic lobbying records. We were able to do this sort of analysis of when they were working together with or sharing positions with other groups and when they were opposed. And we found some really interesting patterns, like there tends to be sort of a coalition of solar companies, conservation groups, social greens, and sometimes they actually are supported by the utilities. Utilities are fine with things like offshore wind, but they're not okay with solar. On the case of solar, the utilities lobby much more frequently against it. Why is that? We didn't know that. Because on solar, apparently, they see it as a threat to the amount of electricity they can sell. If you put solar panels on your roof, you're taking away from stuff that you have to buy from them. And the power generators are the power plant people, and they oppose everything. They oppose the wind and the solar. So anyway, we went through and we looked at a series of different issues, and the patterns are all different on different issues. This is a sort of a It's called a Sankey diagram about what happens to all the bills that are introduced, and the green ones are the ones that the utilities liked. And you can see at the beginning, there's a lot of bills that the utilities don't like, and at the end, there's only bills that the utilities like. So I mean, this is a lot to talk about, but the utilities are uniquely successful at blocking. They blocked 120 bills, and they managed to get, you know, these 6 big bills through that they liked. So they're the winners. They win all the time. So utilities means, you know, National Grid or other companies in Massachusetts, Eversource and so on. So the environmental group supported dozens of bills, but only a few get through. Public testimony is skewed to pro-climate actors, like 10 to 1. Lobbying spending was the other way around. The industrial interests were spending about 6 times as much as the environmentalists on lobbying. And the big interests were fossil fuels, real estate, power generators, but utilities were the most powerful actors. So I need to move on to some things we might do. So we have a study right now looking at public utility commissions, and we're going around all the 6 states of New England and trying to bring together workshops. We're identifying roadblocks, and we're trying to broker a path forward with workshops. So I think hopefully, you know, academics can do a little bit of convening and bring people together. There's much more to talk about here. We also do briefings at the State House or with the agencies. We go to Washington now instead of to the UN negotiations, and we do briefings. This is with Senator Whitehouse in the Foreign Affairs room. There was a group. We created a group of academics called the Climate Social Science Network, which is focusing on trying to understand these politics of climate change. We now have about 250 scholars around the world, and I invite people doing research to join. We have all these working groups. Sorry I'm moving so fast, but I really want to give time to our other speakers. I want to tell the story quickly about the effort to divest the endowment at Brown University from coal and other fossil fuels. This started in 2013, and there were huge protests outside the trustees meeting. It's called the corporation. And unfortunately, they voted no, or they didn't actually vote, they just decided no. But from that came other movement called Fossil Free Brown, and then we worked on carbon pricing, the Sunrise Movement. Some of our leading activists have become national leaders in the Sunrise Movement. We have a group called Scholars at Brown for Climate Action that I'll talk about, and a brand new group called Students Against Koch Influence, the Koch brothers, Charles Koch especially. That's working to keep them off campus. Whoops. So we have a big policy paper we put together about advancing Brown's response to the climate emergency, and that's at this Scholars at Brown for Climate Action webpage. And we spent about a year working on that, faculty, students, graduate students, postdocs, and I'm really quite proud of that. We looked at curriculum and some of the things that you at Salve already have been working on. Curriculum, our campus operations, our footprint in the community, and so on. So this is our webpage over here. We have one small, sorry, I'm gonna just get right to it, request into a committee called the Advisory Committee on University Resource Management, where we're asking the university to stop doing business with organizations that advance disinformation, directly or indirectly funding or receiving such support. So we have specific information that we want to be added to the Brown webpage and to the way we do business. It's like saying we're going to avoid doing business with organizations that knowingly undermine science or science-based policy. And now we're setting up a protocol for how we would identify those organizations. So we'll see if this flies. This went to that committee in January. We put in a revised version, and we put in this concept note last week. And they voted last Monday, and then they day before yesterday they met again, and they gave their proposal to the president yesterday. So we'll see if this flies. But the idea is and it's based a lot on this article by some of our researchers to try to identify foundation funding and U.S. climate change counter movement organizations. There's so much to talk about here. Why I think this really helps universities, providing a safeguard against being in bed with, partnering with organizations that are really undermining our mission as an educational institution, demonstrating our commitment to protecting science, building on research across our departments, and then learning, being a leader on the forefront of multidisciplinary scholarship. It would be so cool if Salve and other universities would, join in a consortium of universities to stop doing business with climate disinformation organizations. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Now we'll get out of the way.
Yeah, there's more to come for you. So thank you so much. You lay out for us in stark terms both the realities of climate and injustice and the needs for action, and also some of the challenges for furthering that reality, both here and much more broadly, but also some encouragement both within the state and the challenge for us as a university. And I know for us too, within the McAuley Institute, looking at our faculty, our students, and the ways in which our research and teaching can support these efforts as well. So thank you very much for laying that table for us. And I'd like to invite now up Dr. Jim Chace to respond and engage this from the perspective of us here at Salve.
Awesome, thank you. Can you hear me okay in the back? Is this working all right? Yep, perfect, great. So thank you, Dr. Roberts, for your lecture tonight and the information that you've brought to share with us, and some really great questions for us to ponder. I don't want to take too much time because I really want to get to hearing other folks' questions, and I really want to hear from my co-delegates who were able to travel with me to Scotland back in November to COP26, Flo and Cassidy, where we had an opportunity to engage in this international issue with a global community dealing with climate change, and it's my hope that we'll be able to continue that tradition. And I'm looking at our president, Dr. Armstrong, and Teresa Welpley, who really helped to orchestrate this. That we'll have other faculty have this opportunity, and many other students get this opportunity to do this. I just really want to comment on a few things, raise a few questions, and then turn it over to the students to get their perspective, and then hopefully we can get a lot of good discussion going. It's wonderful to have so many people back together again, and to get our community to see everybody. So a couple of things that really stand out to me, and you started with, the idea of action, right? And we need action both at the highest level, the political level, and also down to the local level. And you spent quite a bit of time on the local level, and that's both some encouragement, but also some challenges that are there. And we always end up in this climate change debate or conversations where there's this issue between, what do individuals do, while we sit there and get frustrated because our government's not doing enough, and especially the United States government, which is very heavily invested in a number of these issues across the globe, and really a leader in a negative way so many times. As we wait for something to happen at a higher level, we wonder what we can do at the local level. And yet you provide us an opportunity to think about it local in maybe a different way. Local in terms of what is our state doing? How come our state is on the low end? And why is, if I remember from the graph, Vermont and Maine, why are they doing so much better than we are? And then, some really great inspiration coming out of Brown, right? Another institution in our state doing some wonderful things about climate action. And what could we be doing here? I mean, we are a Mercy institution after all, and we have the highest percentage of Catholics of any state, I understand. Maybe there's more that we should be doing and leading the way on this instead of waiting for others to show the way. Some other thoughts that came to mind as you were speaking, just thinking about carbon neutrality and trying to get down that very steep ski slope that you pointed out to us. Certainly some big challenges there are on transportation, since all of it primarily is based on oil. And maybe we'll be able to talk a little bit about the electric highway and what that means for individual cars. But you know, you don't hear much about electric transport of what we don't see on all the goods and services that come to us, that indirect transport, the miles involved in our daily lives that we don't actually travel ourselves. And maybe you'll have some things to share on that in some conversation. You did bring up some really great points about the grid and our electricity and how we're invested so heavily in natural gas. When I was in Scotland and at COP26, I noticed there's quite a lobbying group for more nuclear power. Maybe some thoughts on, you know, what's our future for energy, electricity. We see lots of options for solar. You pointed out wind. We're heavily invested in natural gas. How long is it going to take to shift away from that? What are we going to shift towards? We're importing a lot of energy from other states. What does that look like? What should we be doing? And ultimately, in order to get off that steep ski slope and get down to a point where we hit carbon neutrality to try to keep from going over 1.5 degrees Celsius globally, we're going to have to find a way to sequester carbon. We haven't really had a chance to talk about that very much. And you might have some thoughts, Dr. Roberts, on that. We could maybe talk about sequestration, carbon capture technologies, and what that looks like into the future. And then we haven't spent a lot of time, and I know you've spent a lot of your career thinking about people in other places and the impacts of our actions here and how they are felt in other parts of the globe. And I know that this university and our students and our faculty and staff really care about that. That's very important to them. And maybe we could spend a little time thinking about and talking about what it means to be in solidarity with the people from around the globe on these actions or these inactions, as it turns out to be. There was a lot of that discussion going on at COP26, and I know that Cassidy and Flo will probably have a few things to say about that. I think I'm supposed to advance the slide. No, maybe not. I can't remember where my slides go, but is there a couple more? There we are. But I want to invite Flo and Cassidy to come up, and I want them to share their reflections and comments and questions that they picked up both in Scotland at COP26, but also they've been so heavily invested here as students through their career and different courses and with their own individual actions and studying. So I'm going to just invite them to come up, and I'll step aside.
So I guess I'll start by stating the 2021 emissions gap report that was released later last year that says that we are in a world of climate promises not yet delivered. Touching back to the Paris Agreement, one of the most ambitious global climate agreements that we've had so far, instead of investing in green technologies and green solutions, as Dr. Roberts mentioned, we continue to invest in actions to halt climate action for financial benefit. We are leaving the climate crisis in the hands of money-making mechanisms that do it for financial benefits. And a lot of the climate consequences that we're facing are due to the G20 countries that are responsible for 78% of global emissions, and all thanks to political power and largely ignorance. The media is not as far as we'd like it to be so far. We don't see a lot of the consequences that are caused by climate change. And a lot of the disappearing islands around the world and the indigenous communities that are largely affected by them go under the radar, and they're unheard of, and they're largely ignored both by governments and the public. At the current state that we're in, we need around 4 times higher ambition to reach the 2 degrees, to get on the 2 degrees Celsius track, and 7 times higher ambition for 1.5 degrees Celsius. So it's really about getting over climate denialism and getting in touch with reality, I guess.
I think to tie back into some of the things that Dr. Roberts and Dr. Chace had touched upon, that really stood out to me was the concept of greenwashing, to get a little bit away from the government action and more towards business and private actions. Greenwashing is this kind of notion that companies recognize that people want more done and want more environmental conscious actions to be made. And instead of directly doing those things that are genuinely beneficial, they have now turned and resulted into a lot of things like marketing for net zero carbon emissions, which are really just planting trees that we have just deforested over time. And there is a limitation to that, and that's not something that those companies are marketing. They're really making a lot of money trying to present themselves as these eco-conscious organizations that really aren't eco-conscious at all. They're just trying to make more money off of you, trying to play to your wants and desires, and aren't actually doing what needs to be done. And I think that that just really ties back into that lack of government action and kind of denialism that everybody previous to me has mentioned. And I think that it's super important to take into consideration those conscious actions that you can make as a consumer and as somebody who is involved in your government, and make those steps, as Dr. Roberts was talking about, to really get involved and make the change that you actually want to see and that'll be effective in this world. And I think then to kind of touch upon some of the things that Flo had mentioned, just really being cognizant of those communities that are experiencing climate change firsthand and to a much higher extent than we are. Just because we aren't directly experiencing it to that extent that we are, we can't just continue to deny and pretend that we're okay and that we're living in a comfortable environment and we're never going to be affected, because that's not the case.
Yeah, I want to save some time for the questions from the audience too. But on greenwashing, it's a huge issue right now. I think one of the notes that I had in the bottom of my screen on that graph showing the $350 million of advertising per year just from the 5 companies. I mean, it's billions and billions. Really, it's like as I used to say, a carpet bombing of the American mind. The advertisement is just pervading, and you see the same ads again and again, and it just eventually your brain says, oh, that must be the case. And when they are saying, we're dealing with it and we've got this problem solved. So I think awareness of that and really research on it is really important. On the emissions gap that Flo talked about, it's a huge problem that we have an ambition gap. And so the pledges that are being made are getting a little better, right? We saw there was some progress in Glasgow on the pledges, but it was not nearly enough. But it was something. I mean, it's like Glasgow, I don't know if you all had this feeling of just sort of like, did anything good happen, or is the glass half full or half empty? Half the people there are saying, this was a disaster, and some people are saying, no, something good did happen. But in the first week, I really saw amazing positive statements from world leaders that I said, this sounds different than I've ever heard at these talks before. But then as the 2 weeks went by, as you try to get every country in the world to agree language, it gets watered down and watered down and watered down. So this emissions gap, as you said, 70% of the emissions are coming from the 20 largest countries, the G20. They really do need to lead right? That was the point you were making? Yeah, and that we need to, as you said, understand what's going on in the poorest countries and the most vulnerable countries. And I have a whole talk about that. And I always wondered if people, which focused on the emissions gap and then also the vulnerability of the poorest countries. And I always felt like people didn't know what to do with it, that they care, but they it's kind of good to focus. I mean, to me, it drives all of my actions, all my concern about climate change is the impact that we're having on the low-lying, island states, on the, sub-Saharan Africa, and even just people in the United States that can't live in a safer place or adapt when there's a heat wave or so on. So acting, what does it mean to be in solidarity with people around the world, I think really is to act quickly on climate change, reducing our emissions, but then also, you probably heard in the negotiations a lot of demands for funding, right? That the poorest countries are saying, we need your help to, build a seawall, to change our crops, to dig new wells, to desalinate our water because the salt water is intruding, because to help us deal with droughts and so on. So that's adaptation. There's the mitigation is reducing emissions. We have to do that, and we have to help the poor countries adapt to climate change. You had some other things about nuclear power and transportation, and I actually am okay with nuclear power, especially if we do need the current nuclear power plants to stay on while we develop our renewable power. But I think it's going to be very difficult to site any new nuclear power. I mean, it takes a decade to put in a nuclear power plant at least, and then there's a good chance that it'll fail. I mean, the U.S. has not, as I'm recalling, built any nuclear power plants since the 3 Mile Island disaster in 1979. Yeah, so thank you. A long time. How many years is that? 40 years. Nuclear is great because it doesn't create any carbon emissions. It doesn't warm the planet, but it does create this toxic stuff that is going to be around for long after we're gone, and so we don't really have a good way to handle it. So it's not a good solution. It's not necessarily cheap, and I think the renewables have gotten a lot cheaper. And then now there's storage, so we need a whole generation of science on batteries, and which are getting better. And anyway, there's very exciting science to be done on these things. And the same with electric transportation. I think that's what you were asking, can we electrify transportation?
Right, it seems that we can electrify, you see a lot of advertisements for electric personal vehicles, but
Right.
you're not hearing much about transport of goods in large
Right.
cargo electric
Right.
vehicles.
Right, so there are electric trucks, big semis, but they're just at their first generations, and buses and so on. And certainly buses, electrifying diesel buses is a great, sort of justice issue for urban neighborhoods where there's high asthma rates and so on. You sort of get a double win with that. And Rhode Island is just starting to phase in some electric buses. But you have to figure it out. I mean, some of the batteries are okay. They're not perfect yet, and they'd be great for school buses, for example, because they sit around all in the middle of the day when they could be charging and all night. So anyway, there's much more action we could take on climate change. Oh, and sequestering carbon you asked about. So yes, we are going to have to sequester some carbon, but I think it's not been proven to be economical yet. You can certainly plant trees and manage your soils better in agriculture, which are, I think, the best things to do right now. And keep researching other stuff. Yeah.
I think there's some mics. There are mics that go around.
Any mics?
I think so. Yeah, so not to bring TikTok into such an intellectual discussion,
No,
but
it's great.
I did see one today that was this woman talking about how she used to be vegan, and she used to be zero waste, and she used to, you know, be very strict with her climate action. And then she was saying that now, a year later, she is focused less on personal action and more on like using that energy to look into big action and fighting against corporations. So I'm wondering, like, how do you guys weigh the value of personal action? And are we wasting too much energy trying to, you know, grow gardens in our backyards rather than fighting against and, you know, all trying to develop a sort of hive mindset? Like, how do you guys value personal action, I guess?
We should start down with you guys.
I would say that personal action leads you to a global action. I think that by changing things in your personal life, you can learn from them and then you can see what can contribute to your own community, because solutions won't translate to every community or every culture. So I'd say start there and then see what you could do, because what you learn might inspire you to go towards a professional career in the field. I don't know.
I think building off of what Flo just expressed, I don't think personal action is ever a bad thing. I don't think it should be prioritized over that bigger action. I think that part of those companies that are trying to make it sound like they're doing really great is by putting some of the blame of their own emissions and their own actions on the general public. I think that it's good to make those adjustments in your life and to see what can be applicable to more of your local community, like what Flo was mentioning. But I think it's also very important to take those steps towards bigger action and to really petition those companies, those organizations, your government, to whatever scale that may be.
Wait, are you the sociology major or?
No.
No, because that's, I think you just spoke as a sociology major. Very well informed.
Disciplinary department that we have.
Yeah. Well, I'll just chime in and then I'll hand it to you, but just to say, yes, we need all of the above, of course. But I think there was long an assumption that individual action would automatically take people to bigger action, and I don't think that's the case. People they drive their SUV to the recycling center and they think they're done. And they aren't done. I mean, that's just the beginning. And really joining in collective organizations, you know, like an environmental climate organization, climate justice organizations, I think working together and driving political change. Because we make decisions, all these individual choices we make are in the context of, you know, whether the electric cars are affordable, whether the batteries are being developed, whether the individual types of certain groups are suffering the worst and so on. So there's much bigger things to be done as well.
I'll just maybe throw it back out to the audience and just ask the question of what can we as a community be doing, right? Because we can engage in much bigger action as a group, as a university, if we decide to. But what is it we should be doing? What should be the things? I'll just throw that out to the audience and see if any ideas percolate, or maybe somebody else has a question.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for today's intellectual seminar. Now, speaking of your question, Dr. Chace, you first mentioned that we need more ambition. Youth around the world are doing lots of ambition, and leaders are requesting us to come to like events such as like COP, pre-COP, etc. But the thing is, not only they're not listening, our proposals are literally, how do I say, being ignored. I remember there's a pre-COP event called Youth for Climate. We did a zero draft. We're supposed to do that. And in COP, my fellow colleagues, what they saw is just the draft itself being completely dismissed. So not only they're marketing, let's say, to have more ambition from youth, but our requests are seeming to them like very ambitious. What we decided to do is turn to our local communities, whether it's like universities, local governments, etc., try to work with them personally. what we could do right now here as like, let's say the Salve community, even the Brown community, is first climate education. This was one of our main requests in Youth for Climate, which is a pre-COP event. This is one of the most important parts as we are raising awareness to our communities, and this will reflect on their own communities, such as their parents, friends, etc. So climate education should be enforced into schools by maximum, let's say 2025. And when I'm speaking climate education, not from an environmental standpoint only, we're speaking about policies taken, about steps you could take as mitigation, how you could decrease your carbon footprint and go to, let's say, this compost lifestyle, net zero lifestyle. Second would be us as a Salve community having more sustainable, let's say, products. Like, for example, you could go to the dining hall and see that we have all of those products which are plastic, etc. It's those small things that start a change. Just being able to be one of the most sustainable campuses is one of the most rewarding things that we could take as a step moving forward. And one thing I've noticed with big industries, like, for example, Etihad Airways, etc., one thing is they're doing is that they're having a sustainability officer. We could implement such thing at academic institutes or other places to see how we can make our communities more sustainable from the smallest things possible, to first raise awareness and actually ourselves make sure that we are not contributing to what we could say is harming our climate, specifically as a Mercy institution that focuses on Earth. That's all. Thank you so much.
I think we might have time for one more question. There's one more question out there.
Thank you all for your presentation. I'm going to answer Dr. Chace and really address it to the student as well. One of the ways, and Dr. Roberts, the things we could do locally sometimes are simply looking at our zoning board. So for every one of your hometowns, if you look at what's happening on the zoning board, if you look at what's happening on the planning board, those are places that are, those are commissions and boards that are making decisions about how the land is being used in your town. And many of those uses are not compatible with climate change, but they are compatible with what developers need. So it's something as simple as finding what is your planning board from the town you live in, what's the planning board, what's the zoning board, and what are they approving? And just being aware of what they're approving, because that's locally, really, really locally, that's where a lot of changes could happen. And then this is the pitch I give all the time, is eventually you all need to run for office because policies change when you run for office and make those changes. So thank you.
Aida, thank you for each of our questions and comments. I think you add to this conversation that we, and your point about climate education, we hope even through today's conversation that is a commitment for our university in this direction for all. And who is the university? It's us in this room too. So we know that the institutional action is also related to our action. And so the ways in which we are connected to this common good can expand further as we carry forth this mission into the world. So thank you so much for those specific charges and also that educational kind of call to go deeper and then to translate this commitment, not just to dialogue, but to reflection and action in the world. We're really grateful for you, Dr. Roberts, for what you have brought to us today, for your research and your commitment, and for the ways in which you situate that in a larger commitment to the common good and our common home. And our respondents here today, Dr. Chace and Flo and Cassidy, both for what you've shared today, but also the ways in which you enact this here at Salve, and also knowing what careers you're continuing to pursue really give some hope even in that one bill passed, in the legislature, or this encouragement to go into, further advocacy, that we can see that climate action is hard, but the political power in relationship to the common good gives us some hope for what you've given us today. Also, today's event, as we mentioned at the beginning, is a part of the McAuley Institute's Mercy Collaborative around the critical concern of Earth. And this is a group of faculty and students too that have been a part of research and teaching to advance work on the critical concerns. And so today, several of our faculty are here from the collaborative, and we invite you to join us in Earth Week in April. On April 21st, the faculty from the collaborative will be able to share out some of the research and teaching that they've been working through the course of the last 2 years. So we hope that you can join us to continue that conversation and see other ways that you can be engaged in this interdisciplinary enterprise too, around climate justice. So that is April 21st. So just a little plug for another invitation to be able to engage here at Salve. Also, this is, we shared, the inaugural critical concern lecture for the McAuley Institute. So we're asking for your feedback too. You'll get an invitation on email to give us some feedback. So I just alert you to that and ask for you to give us some of your thoughts and input as we continue to grow. And thank you now. I'd like to thank all of you for coming, but I'd ask you to help me thank our panelists once more for their contributions today. Thank you so much.
So it's not urgent. But here, let me clean it up. Negotiation, I did that with Senator Shell, White House, and they will go. Thank you so much for that. I always get told that this.
Hello. Okay. Sure. Oh, that's okay. I'm sorry, we'll miss you. Yeah. 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 Well, I hope that you'll get another chance to connect, because I think he's a good person to. Yeah. Yeah. Good, thank you. Thank you, but I understand. I understand. We'll have many more spaces to engage together.